Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and as Sherman headed back to Louisiana, talk of secession was hitting a high point, and Sherman would have to make a decision. The candidates for the election of 1860 were chosen. The Republican Party chose Abraham Lincoln. The Southern Democrats chose Vice President John C. Breckinridge. The Northern Democrats chose Stephen Douglas, and the new Constitutional Unionist Party chose Tennessean John Bell. Sherman put his support behind John Bell, the same man that Thomas Ewing backed. However, he tried to convince himself that even if Lincoln was elected, that nothing would happen. But if John Bell got into the presidency, there would be somewhat of a 4-year truce while the country sorted out the slavery issue. Sherman was greatly confused by all of the rhetoric of the South. He told his brother that Southerners were arguing not against what you say or what you do, but what they imagine you will do when you get in power. Quarreling over slavery in the territories made even less sense, Sherman thought, because no sensible man with liberty of choice would ever think of taking his slaves to Utah, Arizona, or New Mexico. Sectional blindness and prejudice is that planters have nothing else to do but to hang abolitionists and hold lynch courts. There that all the people of Ohio are engaged in stealing and running of blacks. The truth is, each does injustice to the other. If all would forget and mind their own respective interests, it would be found that slavery and all other property in the United States was at a most prosperous standard. Everyone was making money, so why argue? Sherman asked. If war came because of slavery, we deserve a monarch, and that would be the final result. Sherman became increasingly depressed as he went back to Louisiana in October of 1860. He feared that the hatred of Northerners in the South would lead to the school forcing him to leave. He started to contemplate working in the salt works owned by his father-in-law or possibly rejoining the army. Everything was very uncertain in Sherman's mind. He saw Southerners talk gleefully of disunion, and Sherman wrote to his friend Braxton Bragg, "A fishworm would resist breaking in the middle, much more so a great nation." When the school session started back, he found the cadets unusually unruly. At one point, they rioted over their food and broke dishes and fired weapons. 5 students were expelled for their actions. During practice elocutions, Sherman saw that all the students seemed to choose disunion topics, defending the South, secession, and slavery. He made known that he believed secession was treason, was war. As the election approached, friends urged Sherman to vote, which Sherman declined to do. He was for the Constitutional Union Party, but he didn't believe John Bell stood a chance of winning. Since Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in Louisiana, not voting would make it appear that Sherman was siding with Lincoln. His friends wanted him to vote in order to stay in the political good graces of Louisianians, but he refused to do so. When Lincoln was elected, South Carolina left the Union. Sherman paced in his room crying. He would write, "There can be no peaceful secession. Secession means war. You are driving me and hundreds of others out of the South who have cast fortunes here, love your people, and want to stay. Yet I must give up all and go away, and if war comes, as I fear it surely will, I must fight your people whom I best love." Sherman knew that Louisiana would soon take up the secession discussion. He stated, "As long as Louisiana is in the Union, I will serve her honestly and faithfully, but if she quits, I will quit too. I will not for one day or even an hour occupy a position of apparent hostility to Uncle Sam. That government is weak enough, but it is the only thing in America that has even the semblance of a government. These state governments are ridiculous pretenses of a government, liable to explode at the call of any mob. I don't want to be premature, however, and will hold on to the last moment in hopes of change. I have great faith that the nation will yet be preserved through the efforts of good men, North and South." Sherman saw secession as the breakdown of law and order, just like he saw in California and its mob rule. The law is, or should be, our king. We should obey it, not because it meets our approval, but because it is the law, because obedience in some shape is necessary to every system of civilized government. In January 1861, Louisiana left the Union. Sherman asked to be relieved, but the Board of Supervisors claimed there was no suitable replacement, so Sherman relented. However, Louisiana's troops began to take over arsenals and confiscate weapons. Those weapons were sent to Sherman at the seminary because of its recently built arsenal. Now there was no question. Sherman wrote 2 resignation letters to the governor. In one he wrote, "Every allowance should be made to the Southern politicians for their nervous anxiety about their political power and the safety of slaves, he would stay for about a month after tendering his resignation, fulfilling all of his obligations to the school. His integrity wouldn't let him do anything less. Meanwhile, Louisianians wrote to him encouraging him to stay and fight alongside them. Braxton Bragg wished he would have stayed, but understood his reasoning. Bragg prayed for Sherman's success and happiness in the future. In a reversal of Sherman's previous thoughts, he told Ellen that he would come and work at the salt works, and that he didn't feel he wanted to be in an army fighting a civil war. But Ellen, Thomas Ewing, and his brother-in-law Hugh Ewing, and his brother John all agreed that he should join the army and fight to preserve the Union. However, Sherman didn't want to fight his friends. He had longed to rejoin the army to be close to them, but a civil war pit him against many of his most dear friends whom he considered family. After saying a tearful goodbye to his cadets and the professors of the seminary, Sherman left for New Orleans, where he boarded a train on March 1st and set off for Ohio. His brother John invited him to Washington to discuss the situation. He gladly went and was introduced to Abraham Lincoln. The president asked how the people of Louisiana was getting along down there. Sherman told him that the Southerners were preparing for war. Lincoln responded, "I guess we'll manage to keep house." Sherman was astounded at the lack of urgency in Washington about the secession crisis. He told his brother that "you politicians have got things in a hell of a fix, and you may get them out as best you can." Sherman was leaving for St. Louis. He was offered a job as the president of the 5th Street Railroad Company. Sherman brought Ellen, all 5 of their children, and 2 servants with them to St. Louis as he worked on railroad business. The political fervor was hitting a fever pitch as Sherman attempted to negotiate the political waters of a divided Missouri. Sherman made it known to the officials in Washington that his services were accessible to them, but he didn't push the issue. When Jefferson Davis sent arms and ammunition to an arsenal in St. Louis, Federal forces under Nathaniel Lyon surrounded it and took the pro-Confederate defenders as captives. Sherman and his son Willie watched the proceedings as the rebels were marched down the road by the Federal troops. A drunk in the crowd that gathered attempted to cross the path of the soldiers and was knocked down an embankment. When the drunk recovered, he pulled out a pistol and shot into the passing soldiers. A bullet hit an officer in the leg, and both sides began exchanging gunfire. Sherman threw Willie into a ditch and covered him with his own body to protect the child. The shooting resulted in 28 deaths and an undetermined number of wounded. In June, Sherman's family members in Washington convinced the administration of their need for Sherman's services. He was called to Washington and found that he was to become a colonel of the new 13th Regular Army Regiment. After speaking with Winfield Scott, he was named an inspector general and had him ride around Washington, D.C. evaluating the military situation. Finally, on June 30th, he was transferred to the army commanded by Irvin McDowell that was to invade Virginia. He would command the 3rd Brigade of Daniel Tyler's 1st Division. When he met his new command, one soldier described him as a tall, gaunt form clad in a threadbare blue coat, the sleeves so short as to reveal a long stretch of bony wrist, the trousers at least 4 inches less than usual length. He sported a bushy, untrimmed beard, his cheeks were hollow, and below a shock of dark auburn hair was a great bulging forehead and a pair of sharp, piercing eyes. He looked more like a disheveled farmer than an army officer, and several volunteers thought about demanding a replacement. Sherman was now back in the army and prepared to bring order to the disordered South that secession had caused.